You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 369 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show is Joanne Leon. She is the host of the Around the Empire podcast, although pretty much all of you should know Joanne and be pretty familiar with her. She's been a guest on the show, I would say close to 10 times now. I would imagine, Joanne, we've probably done 20 episodes together, whether it's your show or my show. So I always enjoy talking to you. I think you bring an interesting perspective, especially since, you really come from this, from a Democrat background where I came from a Republican background. You're now on the anti-war left. I'm an anti-war libertarian. And it creates, I think, a really cool way that, we're able to get information from different sources and look at it from different viewpoints. But at the end of the day, we kind of have the same philosophy on the wars. So I'm really happy to have you on for the particular topic of breaking down the DNC field for me. I got to say that I have heard about half these people before the debate, and I'm somebody who I think follows politics pretty closely. It's almost always on the foreign policy angle, but that being said, I do watch congressional committee hearings on different war bills and stuff like that, but I don't know who a lot of these people are, so I got Joanne on here to help me break all that down, and you ready to get rolling here? All right, go ahead.
Hey, Kyle, thanks so much for having me on. It's always great to work with you guys, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, so debates, I think, at least for me and for most libertarians, the candidate that stands out is Tulsi Gabbard. And here I have the first clip from the debate, that the first answer to a question that she gave. And I think it's kind of probably was like her planned introduction. And so maybe a good way just to introduce Tulsi as a candidate real quick to anybody who's not super familiar with her.
Yeah, well, first of all, let's recognize the situation we're in, that the American people deserve a president who will put your interests ahead of the rich and powerful. That's not what we have right now. I enlisted in the Army National Guard after the al-Qaeda terror attacks on 9/11, so I could go after those who had attacked us on that day. I still serve as a major, served over 16 years, deployed twice to the Middle East, and in Congress serve on the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committees for over 6 years. I know the importance of our national security, as well as the terribly high cost of war. And for too long, our leaders have failed us, taking us from one regime change war to the next, leading us into a new Cold War and arms race, costing us trillions of our hard-earned taxpayer dollars and countless lives. This insanity must end. As president, I will take your hard-earned taxpayer dollars and instead invest those dollars into serving your needs. Things like health care, a green economy, good-paying jobs, protecting our environment, and so much more.
So, Joanne, I think that was Tulsi's effort to kind of give herself an introduction, since she wasn't going to get one and probably wasn't going to get much time to speak. She brings up her military career, and I think her strongest and most important issue, I think the question directed at her was about healthcare or something like that. And she totally just took it and ran the direction she wanted to go with it. I liked it. What about you?
Yeah, I thought it was good, especially since Tulsi's not entirely ignored in this primary, but she's definitely not a priority candidate. And sometimes, when you see polling or you see other things about the primary candidate, sometimes they just leave her name out altogether. So she has a name recognition problem. And I think her goal here was to get people to know who she was and to make an impression on them about what her top priority is, which is definitely national security, and just the balance, the imbalance of how much blood and treasure we're spending on wars when those resources and that attention should be directed back to the American people. I think that's her main thing. She does mention healthcare. She mentions a green economy and the environment. So she makes it clear that some of the top issues that are, that are the highest priority in this election, are her priorities too. But she's trying to say that we need to redirect our foreign policy, and she's the one that's most qualified to do it.
Right. And, I think that she was the only candidate I really heard make this connection between, we have all these other problems and we're spending all this money on foreign policy, and how that kind of feeds into the other one. And I think it's an important and strong point. I think it should especially be for the left. I mean, wasting money killing people in the Middle East, instead of, in Tulsi's case, wanting to spend it on healthcare, preventing climate change. I mean, I'm not so much a fan of the spending part, but, if you're taking it away from blowing people up, I'm always on board with that. But that doesn't seem to be something that many of these candidates want to say or even suggest may be a good idea. Right.
And it's more recently, it's more of a problem for Democrats. I guess the Democratic Party, if you think about the anti-war movement, you think about the left and you think about maybe the Democrats, but it's just unfortunately not true. There always has been, or at least since like the 90s, Democrats feel the need to sort of overemphasize that they're tough, that they're not hippies, they're not peaceniks, they're still qualified to be commander in chief, and they're going to be tough on all this stuff, and they love the military, and sometimes female candidates feel the need to overemphasize being tough too, to overcome stigma. But it's really veered out of control more recently, and Democrats, in fact, in 2016, they actually allied and became the anti-Trump quote unquote resistance, and even allied on foreign policy with the most hawkish neocons, which is bizarre. And it doesn't make any sense. But that's the way it is. That's how much influence the military industrial complex and the intelligence agencies and the war machine has. The Democrats are actually some of the biggest hawks now. And she is definitely setting herself apart from the rest of them in this case.
Yeah. So next, I want to talk about Iran. In the first debate, you had Tulsi up there with a whole bunch of lightweights on foreign policy. I mean, really, they should have thrown the first Iran question towards Tulsi just because she was the one that's, most able to articulate an answer that's sensible. Elizabeth Warren, I guess, does have some understanding of the Middle East, but by and large, the people on that stage really didn't seem to have a clue. But I was even a little disappointed with Tulsi here, because I think I could defend Obama's nuclear deal better than any of these Democrats who, claim to love Obama. And I think most of these, would at least publicly put Obama up and say like, oh, he was this great commander in chief and did all these great things, saying that they have problems with the Iranian nuclear deal. So I'm not sure, Joanne, if you want to weigh in. This was one of the points where we had a question where they're all raising their hand. And I think Cory Booker was the only one of the first 10 that said that he wouldn't immediately re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal.
Well, I think that Tulsi said she would definitely get back in that deal. In fact, she urged Trump to back down, to swallow his pride, and to get back in that deal. But I do think at one point she said something like she thinks that she could improve that deal. So
I think she said, it wasn't perfect a couple times, which to me just reeks of this whole, well, Maduro's an evil dictator, but you know what I mean? Like, stand up and defend it, Tulsi. Say this deal absolutely took any pretext American neocons and Republicans and war hawks, like the one sitting in the White House right now, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, that they could possibly start a war with Iran. That's why they had to destroy the agreement, so now they could have even an excuse to try to start a war with that country. And it was absolutely one of the greatest things that Barack Obama did. And you know what I mean? That she would be like, it's not a great deal. It really bothers me.
Yeah. I felt the same way. I don't think she specifically said what, she might want to do differently, but Yeah, I think that's a dead end. I really don't think you can get anything more out of that deal than Obama did. And I agree. I disagreed with almost all of Obama's foreign policy, but there he gets A plus for me. I mean, it was almost an impossible thing to do, and they did it.
Right. I have vent a little frustration there that, I probably hate Barack Obama more than most people. And yet here's one of like kind of, I think his crowning achievements. And as somebody that doesn't like him, I could defend it better than the people that are basically, running to, follow in his footsteps. I mean, I think most of them would kind of put themselves in that bubble, maybe other than Bernie Sanders.
Yeah,
kind of being an Obamaite.
yeah. I mean, I'm not sure where they were going with that, but I mean, the only logical thing is that they were just catering to the Israel lobby to some extent, leaving sort of a vague open-ended thing like, well, yeah, I'll help you get a little more or something, but I think it's unrealistic. I don't think it's even possible, but they must have been catering to at least a little bit to, the Israeli or, maybe the Gulf state lobbies who we know are very influential in terms of campaign money and things like that. Well, not the Saudis technically, but the pro-Israel, the pro-Saudi, donors.
Yeah. So anyways, this discussion in the first debate kind of transforms into a discussion about Iran, into a discussion about leaving Afghanistan or not. And Tim Ryan weighed in on this, and then him and Tulsi had a dust up. And this actually, I think, ends up being one of the top highlights of the first debate. I think it was probably the most well heard of the kind of arguments, because most of the other ones there was so much crosstalk that it was hard to hear kind of what was being said. And I really couldn't tell who was talking, I guess, because I didn't know their voices as well or not. But with the contrast of the male-female voice, it was pretty easy to make out who was who. And in this case, so I think Tulsi comes away definitely on top. Joanne, I'll go ahead and let you just say whatever you want about, because I thought this was her best moment.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was her best moment too. And in the first debate, sort of the nature of it was the format was the same and everything, but it was very different from the second night. So it was less contentious. There was actually, believe it or not, even though there was crosstalk and there was, people talking over each other, there was only a tiny amount compared to the following night, the second debate, which was more anticipated. Some of the bigger personalities were there. So, in this night, Elizabeth Warren was probably the best known candidate on the stage. Cory Booker, and I don't know if you can really say, Beto, he's pretty well known, but the other candidates were not that well known. So there's that. But there were only a couple of times when two of the candidates actually really mixed it up. And Tulsi's was probably even more the most memorable of the two. And so Tim Ryan, right? From Ohio, is clearly like a blue dog Democrat. And he starts out by saying that, we really can't leave Afghanistan. We have to remain engaged. He kept using the word engaged. And Tulsi, though it's not really her nature to do it, she actually interrupted him. And, she said something like, and then the moderators actually gave her a little time, and she said, well, what are you going to say to the families of the two troops that were just killed in Afghanistan, which had just happened like that day or the day before? She said, we don't have to remain engaged. And as a soldier, she says, that is unacceptable. And the audience really liked that. There was a lot of cheering. It really kind of threw Ryan off guard there, caught him off guard, and it kind of threw him off balance. And then he started arguing back and saying, well, if we don't remain engaged in Afghanistan, then the Taliban, among other things, he said, then the Taliban, they're going to fly into our buildings again. And, the camera goes back to Tulsi, and you can see her like shaking her head like, oh God, no. And she stopped. She said, the Taliban didn't attack us on 9/11. Al-Qaeda attacked us. And then he went on, he sort of corrected himself and said, well, the Taliban, gave shelter to the people who attacked us on 9/11. And then Tulsi bounced back on that one too and said, well, if there's anybody who's supporting Al Qaeda right now, it's Saudi Arabia. And that kind of stopped him in his tracks. First of all, she corrected him and he made it clear he didn't seem to understand the difference between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, first off. And, second, she completely knocked down his stay engaged thing because she believes that all the troops should be pulled out of Afghanistan. And, so she really kind of, and then she got the dig in there at Saudi Arabia, which really shocked me.
Today, the Taliban claimed responsibility for killing 2 American service members in Afghanistan. Leaders as disparate as President Obama and President Trump have both said that they want to end U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, but it isn't over for America. Why isn't it over? Why can't presidents of very different parties and very different temperaments get us out of there? And how could you?
I appreciate that question. So I've been in Congress 17 years, and 12 of those years I've sat on the Armed Services Committee, either the Defense Appropriations Committee or the Armed Services Committee. And the lesson that I've learned over the years is that you have to stay engaged in these situations. Nobody likes it. It's long. It's tedious. But right now so I would say we must be engaged in this. We must have our State Department engaged. We must have our military engaged to the extent they need to be. But the reality of it is this president doesn't even have people appointed in the State Department to deal with these things. Whether we're talking about Central America, whether we're talking about Iran, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, we've got to be completely engaged. And here's why. Because these flare-ups distract us from the real problems in the country. If getting drones shot down for $130 million because the president is distracted, that's $130 million that we could be spending in places like Youngstown, Ohio, or Flint, Michigan, or rebuilding.
Congresswoman Gabbard, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, actually, to jump off what he said. He described engagement as the problem.
You will tell the parents of those 2 soldiers who were just killed in Afghanistan? Well, we just have to be engaged. As a soldier, I will tell you that answer is unacceptable. We have to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. We are in a place in Afghanistan where we have lost so many lives. We've spent so much money that's coming out of every one of our pockets, money that should be going into communities here at home, meeting the needs of the people here at home. We are no better off in Afghanistan today than we were when this war began. This is why it's so important to have a president and commander-in-chief who knows the cost of war and who's ready to do the job on day one. I am ready to do that job when I walk into the Oval Office.
Thank you very much.
Listen, I'm going to go down the line. I'm going to go down the line here. Well, you know what? You felt like she was responding. You get 30 seconds. Go.
Good man.
Fair enough.
I appreciate that.
I hear what you're saying.
I would just say I don't want to be engaged. I wish we were spending all this money in places that I've represented that have been completely forgotten and we were rebuilding. But the reality of it is, if the United States isn't engaged, the Taliban will grow and they will have bigger, bolder terrorist acts. We have got to have some present there.
The Taliban was there long before we came in. They'll be there long before we leave.
Well,
we cannot keep U.S. troops deployed to Afghanistan thinking that we're going to somehow squash this Taliban that has been there, that every other country that's tried
I didn't say
has failed.
squash them. When we weren't in there, they started flying planes into our buildings. So I'm just saying right now,
the Taliban didn't attack us on 9/11. Al-Qaeda did.
Well,
Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11.
I understand.
That's why I and so many other people joined the military to go after Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban.
The Taliban was protecting those people who were plotting against us. All I'm saying is, if we want to go into elections and we want to say that we got to withdraw from the world, that's what President Trump is saying. We can't. I would love for us to.
Who's protecting Al-Qaeda right now in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, right. And I will throw that clip in the show now. That way, anybody who wants to listen to it, because it is just a fantastic back and forth for Tulsi. That way, y'all could hear. It's about 3 minutes.
Yeah, and a lot of people were basically saying, like slay queen, basically that kind of thing. And yeah, well, Tulsi just ended his political career. So the people who really like to treat this like a sporting event or a gladiator event really enjoyed it too, even if they weren't big Tulsi fans, because Tulsi faces a lot of opposition right out of the gate. She's been smeared left and right. There is a I don't know exactly who they are, but she's getting attacked more from the left than from the right, actually.
Yeah, so I was just going to go ahead and make this observation that I think Tulsi Gabbard was the only one I saw to get a critical question from the moderators. Kamala Harris teed one up for Biden. But other than that, I think the LGBT question that Tulsi got, and, I think everybody, if you want to go listen to the clip, you can. But, think about who Tulsi Gabbard is and what she says. She's not a bigot. So if you want to listen to that, you can, but I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. But that was probably the most critical question that a candidate got from it. And I mean, look at some of the people you have on stage. Cory Booker, who's taking money from Big Pharma. Joe Biden with his history of just absolute disasters and supporting wars. I mean, they could have really gone after some of these candidates and asked critical questions, but didn't.
Right. I saw some people saying Tulsi was the only one who got like a smear question, and I started, thinking it through. And I would say, they hit her where they knew it would hurt because, she did have to correct her record. She has had to talk about her evolution on different issues, and I think almost every candidate has had, has taken some positions in the past that they weren't, that they don't have now and that they aren't proud of now. But I actually disagree that Tulsi's the only one who got a smear question, because I would say that Biden, the question that he got about his vote on the Iraq war was kind of equivalent. I think that was definitely a question meant to damage him. So I would say that only two of them really got smear questions. And then I would say one more. I'd say that Bernie, I think it was the opening question on night 2 of the debate. The first thing they did is the way they framed the question is they demanded a yes or no answer to whether or not he would raise taxes on the middle class, which everybody knows is a really damning thing. There are going to be certain people who are just going to vote against him or not vote for him simply on that. And he has a nuanced answer to it. He tried to answer the question with a nuanced answer. But then, and this is the only time I've seen this happen, the moderator, I think it was Savannah Guthrie, stopped, and demanded that he actually answer the question directly and gave him a little bit more time to do that. So she was going to stick with it until he gave a yes or a no. And he did. He did answer it. So those are the 3 times where I think that some candidates got treated differently than the rest.
I guess I feel like Tulsi's was the most critical and was like more an attack on her character, where at least the one that they were pressing Bernie on, I thought it was a joke because Bernie was really dancing around that question. And maybe the moderator was trying to say like, hey, I'm going to hold these candidates accountable, because I think this was the opening question. And Biden's Iraq war, I mean, that's something that, he did vote for. I think, Tulsi's positions on LGBT changed in her early 20s. So, like that's, I think, very typical development. And I believe she was good on this issue well before like Hillary Clinton and maybe even before Obama.
Yeah, I don't think that it affected her political career. I'm pretty sure that by the time she was in any elected office, she had already changed her position on it. So yeah, in that sense, it was a more nasty hit, and they are reaching back pretty far. Although they did with Biden too. They reached back pretty far, but he was a politician. He was a public official at the time. So even that was more fair game than what they did to Tulsi. And, I can't lie. I mean, she's probably my favorite candidate at the moment. So I'm just trying to be fair. I thought maybe that because I favor her, maybe I saw that as a worse smear than the others. And I do think it was a worse smear than the others. But I just felt like, to be fair, I had to bring up the other ones.
Well, yeah. And especially, if you're going to smear somebody, look at Tim Ryan doesn't know the difference between Al-Qaeda, an international Arab terrorist organization filled with Saudis, Egyptians, and Emiratis that were hiding out in Afghanistan, versus the Taliban, which is with, these guys being actual Afghan fighters. They're an insurgency. It's completely different than the international terrorist group.
Yeah, I think at this point, the Taliban, too, it's kind of hard to differentiate just the local population from the Taliban, right? Aren't they, most of the, literal native Afghanistan people mostly allied with the Taliban now?
I would guess probably the Pashtuns. I don't know. Once you get into the northern areas of Afghanistan where it's more Hazaras, I'm guessing, that's not the case and they're not for that insurgency because, the U.S.-backed government and all the corruption probably works well for them and their leaders, but not so much for the Pashtuns in their areas.
Yeah, you know much more about the population than I do, so I definitely defer to you on that, Kyle. Hello?
Next, I wanted to move on to the second debate. Iran was brought up a couple times. One by Senator Gillibrand, and she was actually good on the issue talking about it. Bernie talked about it in his closing statement. I just wanted to give you the opportunity, Joanne, because Iran really wasn't as big of a deal in the second debate. At least I didn't seem to me. If there's any more interesting statements from the candidates in the second debate.
Right. It did come up. I guess I'm getting them mixed up a little bit, but yes, I do think that I heard more about Iran in the first debate. And I think just Tulsi Gabbard is by far the most foreign policy focused candidate in the whole slate of all 20 of them. So yeah, I do think that it came up more in the first night than it did in the second. And then, Gillibrand actually named the situation with Iran as, I don't know if you want me to go over this, but there are some, in the format of this, like, it was kind of a very strange format. The only rules were that you got 60 seconds to answer a question and 30 seconds for follow-up questions. Let me just see that real quick. I wrote it down at the top. Yeah. The rules were 60 seconds to answer a question, 30 seconds for a follow-up. But, what they did was they just randomly asked questions. So, and also they didn't ask the same question to all of the candidates, except for, I don't know, a handful of times they did ask for a raise of hands or they asked for an across-the-board short answer to a particular question. So you never knew, like, which question was going to be asked of which candidate and how many people were going to get weighed into it. It was completely random. So one of the things that they did, and I should also mention here, Kyle, too, because I was looking at my observations in real time of what was going on in the first debate. And first of all, they placed Elizabeth Warren in the middle of the stage. I don't know if this was random. Supposedly it was a lottery. It was random in terms of who was chosen to compete on the first night and who was chosen to compete on the second night. It didn't have anything to do with your polling numbers or how much money you raised or anything like that. Like with the Republican debate in 2016, there were like 17 candidates and they sorted it out like the kiddie table. The lowest polling people were in the first round, and then the higher polling candidates were in the second round all on the same night. This didn't work that way. It was a mix of people who were polling high and people polling low. And they were chosen by lottery, but where they were placed on the stage, I'm not entirely sure whether that was by lottery or not, because it just so happened that the most popular candidates ended up sort of in the middle of the stage. So there's that. But one of the things they did, there were random questions, and then there were the group questions where everybody had to answer the same question, which in my view were overall, I think, more valuable. And it seemed like from the reactions I've seen, they seemed to be more popular or got more attention than the other questions. But in one of them, they ask everyone to say what they think is the biggest geopolitical threat to the United States. Is it okay to bring that up right now? Or do you want to save that to
No,
later?
that's perfect because that's what I had next on my list. So
okay.
Yeah. Joanne, go ahead and break through what every candidate thought was the biggest geopolitical threat.
Yeah. So they only asked this on the first night, first of all, which I thought, if you're going to do these across the board questions, do them on both nights. But no, they didn't do that. Obviously, it's clear that I had some big problems with this whole format and the fact that it really wasn't a debate. Like, one of the first things I said to this thing is this isn't a debate. So anyway, they did ask everyone toward the end, what do they think is the biggest geopolitical threat to the U.S.? And that's how they phrased it. So I noted what each candidate said. Delaney said that it was China and nuclear weapons. Jay Inslee said that President Trump was the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States. Tulsi said that nuclear war, that we now have a higher risk of nuclear war, and that's the biggest threat to the United States. She got a lot of flack for that, by the way. Bill de Blasio, he's the mayor of New York City, and I have to just interject here real quick that he was framing himself as the peace anti-war candidate, like, through the whole thing. He was coming out with these great positions, and then at the end here, he sort of, in my view, showed that all of that was disingenuous because he came out and said, Russia's the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States. And then Amy Klobuchar said that the Middle East, the situation in the Middle East and the war with Iran, or the prospect of a risk of a war with Iran, was the greatest geopolitical threat. Beto O'Rourke said that climate change was the greatest threat. And then Elizabeth Warren said that climate change was the greatest threat. Cory Booker said that it was both climate change and the nuclear threat. And then Julian Castro said that China and climate change were the greatest threat. And then Tim Ryan said China was the greatest threat. So that was quite a mix, I thought. But Gillibrand, let me try to remember what she said about Iran. I don't know if I noted that, Kyle.
I just noticed that she at one point went out of her way to say that we really need to avoid a war with Iran. So it's not like a huge deal or anything, but especially since the second debate was more dry on the foreign policy topic, I definitely noted that.
Oh, I did find it. I found it. This is another one this is worth saying, I think. Another one of those group questions,
Okay.
which gives a really good sense of where they all stand on foreign policy. One of the group questions was, what would be the first relationship that you would want to reset? All right. So in the second night, they asked a question. They said, what's the first relationship that you want to reset? Marianne Williamson, the author of spiritual self-help books, said that Europe would be her top priority. Hickenlooper said China. Andrew Yang said China. Pete Buttigieg said the entire world. We have to reset relationship with the entire world. Joe Biden said NATO. Bernie said the UN and diplomacy. Kamala Harris said NATO. Kirsten Gillibrand said Iran. And, she was referring to, as you talked about, the, just the total mess that we have in our relationship, the balance of power in the Middle East and such. Bennett said Europe and Latin America. And Swalwell said, this is ridiculous. He actually created a little jingle. He said that his first relationship top priority would be breaking up with Russia and making up with NATO, which is just ridiculous. But anyway, that's how they answer.
So to look at some of these reactions, I think we could clearly see that there are some of these candidates that are at least in the less interventionist camp, and those who are in the more kind of global world order types, and I guess probably coming from it more the liberal side, the responsibility to protect than the neocon nation building, or John Bolton just kicking over anything in the world that looks at all dangerous or threatening to you. So anybody who responded NATO or Europe or anything like that, I'm guessing that that's because they're like, oh, Trump is making up with the dictators and ignoring our nice allies like Angela Merkel in Germany and all these great reformed Western European countries who we should be more like, even though a lot of times, they're just as imperialist and warmongering as the U.S. You had some people that gave just stupid answers, and so I'm assuming that's because they really don't understand geopolitics very much, like the entire world, or, Europe and Latin America. What? That's like 40 countries. That's going to be the first relationship you repair. Again, just a ridiculous answer. And then there were some people who gave, I think thoughtful answers. Anybody who said nuclear weapons as being a geopolitical threat shows that, they have understanding of like how dangerous nukes are. Gillibrand saying Iran, anybody who suggested, I guess resetting the relationship with China isn't a bad thing. Although it really seems to me that a lot of these Democratic candidates, and I was surprised by this, are really concerned with China being a threat. I mean, that part was disturbing to me. Really, I don't understand why they see China as so much of a threat. Certainly labeling them a geopolitical threat. I mean, I guess as an economic competitor is a little bit of a different label, although I could see how some people would interpret that as threatening.
Yeah, the ones who said Europe and NATO, I thought that had sort of imperial undertones, or it could also be interpreted as, they really think that Russia is the biggest threat. And I should say that Swalwell, he's one of the most notorious Russiagators out there. He puts himself in front of every television camera that he can, and he's really pushing hard for Russiagate, for the whole Mueller thing, for impeachment and all of that, which interestingly really didn't come up in these debates, which is kind of shocking because for a few reasons. One of them is that Rachel Maddow was one of the moderators, which is sort of disgraceful in itself. The other is that NBC is totally obsessed and absorbed by Russiagate and the Mueller thing, and yet there were no questions on it, none. I think somebody said that Russiagate, the whole situation, was not mentioned in the whole entire two debates, though I did hear Rachel Maddow mention the Mueller report in one of the questions once, though. But still, it was just, it was as if it wasn't even a big issue.
De Blasio at one point directly referred to Russian hacking being a threat, and there were a couple of comments like that. But isn't this so interesting that you finally get around to the campaign season and nobody is spending their opening or closing speeches saying that the president was illegitimately elected, that Vladimir Putin was behind it, that he conspired with Russia? None of this coming out in the debate. And I guess at least, a part of that should be attributed to, the people in this non-interventionist anti-war movement that have all long been skeptical and been trying to point out the flaws. And you've had so many of these people on your show, Joanne, and we've really talked about it in a lot of detail. And it is great to see that at least that wasn't one of the major issues and topics of these debates. And hopefully it's a reflection that it's going to lose all traction, because as the debates start to really roll on, I'm guessing that's going to consume the news story, and anything not being taught in the Democrat debates or anything not being talked about by Donald Trump probably isn't going to make it into the news cycle very much from here until November 2020.
I kind of find it puzzling, because it's not like the party leadership hasn't, has let go of it, or that they've toned it down or anything. It's still pretty much just as prominent as ever. We have Mueller being subpoenaed, and in a couple of weeks he's going to be in front of Congress. But that seems to be a team strategy. There seems to be, a team strategy, and then there are the individual candidate strategies. And either the candidates themselves have decided that it's not to their benefit to make it a big issue. Some of them have mentioned, not in the debates but elsewhere, that this is not the kind of thing that they're hearing out in the field. This is just not what they're hearing from voters. It's not a concern of voters. And so they're very well aware of that. And right now they're hyper focused on, getting votes. But the party is still, they're running their own electoral strategy right now. And it appears that impeachment is part of that strategy, is to sort of like soften up the opposition from the outside. So I would call this very much a team effort, but I do find it curious that the candidates have either chosen or have been advised to just stay away from it. I mean, but you're right. They do mention that Russia's a threat. They still bring that up, and they do talk about how, Russia still intends to attack or influence our elections.
So there's a couple other topics that occurred during the debates that I want to talk with you about, Joanne. One was the Latin America issue, and this came up in the first debate, I think mostly around the immigration issue, in which, as well as, all the things they were saying they would do in the U.S. about immigration, legalizing and everything, which we don't have to get into on today's show, more in the foreign policy realm, they talked about having a Marshall Plan for Latin America. This, to me, kind of sounded a lot like, again, these candidates really don't know a whole lot about the issue. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the idea of having a Marshall Plan for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
I did not dig into that. I don't really remember that part of the debate. I apologize, Kyle, because I know.
Well, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot to dig into as far as I could tell. I did some Googling. I didn't see any of these candidates having a plan. Why I mean that, this is a bill they've supported in the past or anything like that. There is some, Marshall plans for Latin America stuff floating around out there. But at the end of the day, it just seems to me that it's kind of a sign that they really don't understand what's happened in those countries and what's going on in those countries. Because it's not like Honduras has been bombed, into pieces like Europe was during World War II. And it's not like about just, kind of rebuilding the manufacturing and stuff that was already built before. But it seems like, to me, they're talking about a nation building project of just pumping a whole lot of money into these countries. And, they've talked about how Donald Trump has removed aid from these countries and how that's been horrible. I certainly am not a fan of foreign aid of any kind. Typically, I say cut in the places first, like Israel, and any kind of aid that goes to Egypt or any of the European countries over, cutting more of the humanitarian aid programs going to Latin America. But at the same time, when, we under the Obama administration, you had programs where we were supporting the Tiger Force in Honduras, which has gone on to suppress popular protests in those countries. And so it's not as easy as just saying, oh, we're going to have this plan, pump a whole bunch of money into the country. And, I think that'd just be a short-sighted foreign policy mistake that a lot of these candidates seem ready to bumble into.
Yeah, I mean, and historically, the way the Democrats have approached this is to sort of never acknowledge that our foreign policies, long-held foreign policies, destabilize and disadvantage people in Central and Latin American countries, and this is the reason why a lot of people are fleeing their countries, whether it's unrest or whether it's poverty or whatever. I just looked up the Marshall Plan here, and I do remember this coming up. It was Julian Castro, and he brought up the photo that has been very much in the news of the father and daughter in the Rio Grande River drowned, and that photo really was widespread. And I'm just going to read this from CBS News. They say, quote, discussing a photo published this week of a migrant father and his young daughter face down in a river, having drowned attempting to cross into the U.S. Castro said this photo should spur us into action and piss us all off. Castro said that on his first day as president, he would sign an executive order to end the zero tolerance policy, the Remain in Mexico policy, and the metering policy. He also said that he would support a new, quote, Marshall Plan for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to address the situations in those countries which lead migrants to attempt the dangerous route to enter the U.S. So yes, I agree with you that is completely not acknowledging our role, particularly in Honduras and the Obama policy, supporting the ouster of a democratically elected government in Honduras. Now they've got a really kind of a brutal dictator right there. But no, we're not going to talk about what spurred that and whose fault it was. At least most recent fault. It goes back to a lot of presidents, not just Obama, but Obama and Hillary Clinton's policies there were extremely damaging and definitely generate more migrants. So yeah, that's who brought it up. It's Julian Castro.
All right, last from the debates, kind of just interesting stuff from that I have is the kind of final dust up between Bernie and Biden about the Iraq war. I'll go ahead and play that clip now.
You have made your decades of experience in foreign policy a pillar of your campaign. But when the time came to say yes or no on one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the last century, you voted for the Iraq war. You have since said you regret that vote. But why should voters trust your judgment when it comes to making a decision about taking the country to war the next time?
Because once Bush abused that power, what happened was we got elected after that. I made sure the president turned to me and said, Joe, get our combat troops out of Iraq. I was responsible for getting 150,000 combat troops out of Iraq, and my son was one of them. I also think we should not have combat troops in Afghanistan. It's long overdue. It should end. And thirdly, I believe that you're not going to find anybody who has pulled together more of alliances to deal with what is the real stateless threat out there. We cannot go it alone in terms of dealing with terrorism. So I'd eliminate the act that allowed us to go into war and not the AUMF, and make sure that it could only be used for what its intent was, and that is to go after terrorists, but never do it alone. That's why we have to repair our alliances. We put together 65 countries to make sure we dealt with ISIS in Iraq and other places. That's what I would do. That's what I have done, and I know how to do it.
Senator Sanders, 30 seconds.
One of the differences that Joe and I have in our record is Joe voted for that war. I helped lead the opposition to that war, which is a total disaster. Second of all, I helped lead the effort for the first time to utilize the War Powers Act to get the United States out of the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, which is the most horrific humanitarian disaster on earth. And thirdly, let me be very clear. I will do everything I can to prevent a war with Iran, which would be far worse than disastrous war with Iraq.
Senator Sanders, thank you.
All right, guys. Informed consent of the American people.
So on the second night of the debate, Biden was confronted with a question about his yes vote on the Iraq war. And he really became defensive about this. And he tried to turn it around. He said that, almost that he immediately regretted that, or, he soon regretted, and he, changed his attitude, and then he started working to get the troops out of Iraq, right? And then he proceeded to actually take credit for pulling the troops out of Iraq in, 2011 or something, which did,
he said Obama tasked him or appointed him to do that.
Yeah, in fact, he did it in a folksy way. He's like, Barack, he turned to me and said, Joe, get those troops out of Iraq. And I did, I got those troops out of Iraq. And then he goes on to say, and, we need to get our troops out of Afghanistan. And if I had the chance that I would eliminate the authorization of that bill, he couldn't remember the name of it, the AUMF. He said, I would take that and I would trim it down so that it would be only applied to terrorists. And also we couldn't use it unilaterally. It would always have to be with allies. We'd have to have a coalition. So we would only use that AUMF to fight terrorists, and only with our friends. So Bernie jumped in, or he was given an opportunity. I can't remember. In the second night of the debate, people were, oh my gosh, it was crazy at times. Anyway, people were jumping in all over the place. Bernie definitely got his dig in there. He differentiated himself by noting that he didn't vote for the Iraq war at all. And then he actually took the opportunity to say that he also, it has been working to get out of Yemen as well. And he said, and we have to prevent a war with Iran. So that was probably Bernie's most emphatic and strongest foreign policy statements there. And he didn't equivocate. He took credit for not voting for the Iraq war. Whereas Biden tried to take credit for pulling our troops out of Iraq, Bernie actually has been leading the charge to get out of Yemen and to stop helping Saudi Arabia starve and bomb Yemen. And then, at the end there, he threw that in that, no matter what, we have to prevent a war. We cannot have a war with Iran. So Bernie did pretty well there.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
Biden, maybe people believe that Joe Biden pulled the troops out of Iraq. It was really kind of only a temporary thing anyway, because we're back there. But yeah, that was good for Bernie and bad for Biden. They're all aware, Kyle. They're all, even if they are hawks, they are definitely toning it down for the most part. But they are all aware. Tulsi has definitely had. I actually can't give Tulsi all the credit. Trump gets some credit too. You know, they know that in 2016, Trump's anti-interventionist stance helped him to get votes. And Tulsi is also, while she's not the best known candidate, she's definitely having an effect on their foreign policy's views. She's pulling them toward the anti-interventionist side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm guessing that part of that is because Tulsi is actually armed with some facts and understanding of the Middle East, and that's why she has the views that she does. And so if anybody is going to potentially have to debate her on the issue, they're going to have somewhat similar positions, or else she's going to make them look like a fool, just like she did to Tim Ryan and just like Bernie did to Biden. I thought those were by far for me the two top moments of the debates. I really wish, to be honest, at this point that I had gone back and probably just listened to those 5 minutes in total rather than the two whole things. But maybe this is a good time, Joanne, to give you an opportunity to talk about the Democratic field. A couple things I guess I just were hoping you could touch on are, who do you think are the 2 or 3 best candidates on the war issue? If you only could limit it to 2, that's fine. And then who do you see are the biggest potential hots and threats, of the potential winners? Who do you see as being the biggest hots? And then I don't believe I heard Israel or Palestine in that debate once. Any chance that later becomes an issue and something that the candidates have to grapple with?
Yeah, I don't think. Sometimes I get mixed up what I heard in the debates and what I heard in other interviews and things like that. Like, I know Tulsi has called out Israel, but that was online. That was not in the debate, as far as I know. Nobody brought up Jared Kushner's, Middle East plan, which is whether it's practical or likely to happen or not, it's still a huge thing. It should have been a question, in my view. But no, they avoided that entirely. In terms of who I think, Tulsi is, head and shoulders above everybody else, including Bernie, on foreign policy in terms of an anti-interventionist stance. Bernie comes in second, in my view. And Bernie, while he's been, let's say, unreliable lately, but he's got like a 30-year history. So he has to get some credit for being against the Iraq War. He's got to get some credit for his stances, 20, 30 years ago. So we know that Bernie, he's got it in him.
And he's really been a champion on Yemen. Like, let's, make that unequivocal. Like, had Bernie Sanders not been in the Senate, there may not have been the arms sales brought to Saudi Arabia that happened. I mean, he's really been one of the guys pushing this and looking at a whole bunch of different tactics to try to find some way to end that war. And, not to give too much praise to Bernie Sanders, because there's a lot of things about the guy I don't like, and his foreign policy isn't perfect. He has made a big deal about that. And I do believe that Ro Khanna is on his campaign staff this time around. And yeah. I would put him in like the top 2 or 3 of the entire Congress on the war issue.
Yeah. Ro Khanna is good. He's, like we talked about, there's this thing about Bernie has done it, Ro Khanna has done it. It came out with the Venezuela situation, whereas they, I know I've brought this up in other podcasts, but basically use the metaphor of like, they'll take the regime change ball, like mostly down the field by condemning. The first step is to condemn, demonize, whoever we're going to try to overthrow. That's a big part of the job. And they still are helping to do that job, which is a big problem in my view. He's not doing it in the Middle East so much, but he is doing it in Venezuela. So And Ro Khanna does the same thing. So I do have issues with Bernie's foreign policy stance. I don't think it's as courageous as it should be, and I personally have doubts whether it's the way he really feels. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. But I mean, Tulsi's not perfect either. Tulsi leaves herself this out with the war on terror that I have not heard a satisfactory answer to that yet. Overall, I think there's a really good chance that she is going to be across the board good on war and foreign policy, but kind of like how Joe Biden left himself that out there. He's like, I would repeal the AUMF, but then he says, I would leave the terrorism part in there, and we'd have to just very carefully and with allies still use it to fight terrorism. She seems like there seems to be some reason why, and I guess it's understandable. I mean, there are still threats. We probably think that the best way to address those threats is to, get out of their countries. That's going to solve most of the problem. But, I don't know that everybody agrees with that. And so there's that. Now, the third person, who do I think is best on foreign policy? I mean, that's really kind of hard. Elizabeth Warren seems to be good on it. But, I remember some positions that she took or didn't take in the past that really make me wonder whether she's got the courage to really stand up against the war machine and the national security state. I think Tulsi and Bernie are probably the only two with the courage and the resolve that's, in my view, sort of critical right now. If you don't address that, then, forget about everything else, because you're really not going to be able to get anything else substantial done. In terms of who's the worst hawk, I mean, that's tough. I think Joe Biden, if you look at his record, he's got a
Biden
disaster.
has a terrible record. Booker seems like quite the hawk to me too, and that's really concerning to me.
Yeah. I don't know that I can speak with any real authority on if I haven't really done the research on which ones are really bad, but I just thought across the board I didn't see them prioritizing it, and I just really I have no doubt that Joe Biden is going to be terrible. I think he's going to be awful. And I also think that he's going to lie. In the 2012 election, he had a debate with Paul Ryan, and he emphatically kept promising we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan by 2014, and we're going to do it, period. And of course, Paul Ryan was against that, right? He had taken the other side of the issue. So Joe Biden painted himself as the peacenik, and, what happened with that. It didn't happen, did it? But, they were a little bit of trouble in the 2012 election. There was some question about whether they could be reelected, and they made that promise. And then, they got pushback from the generals and the war machine, and they caved. And we are still in Afghanistan, obviously. So Tim Ryan is obviously bad, right? He wants to remain engaged. So I can pretty definitively put him in that camp. But I don't really even know who else is. They all seem pretty bad. And I hope that Elizabeth Warren will take a good position. Kirsten Gillibrand seemed to be pretty good too. But I'm looking at their history and I'm saying, I don't know. I remember particularly this one incident with Elizabeth Warren. It was during one of the times when Israel was bombing and had invaded Gaza. And it was, it was horrible. It was a massacre. And someone tried to get a comment from Elizabeth Warren on that, and she ran away from the camera. She ran down the hall and she wouldn't answer. She wouldn't even make a statement at all. So I don't have a lot of confidence in her courage.
Well, any chance the Israel issue becomes something meaningful in this debate? Not debate, but in this campaign season? And if so, I mean, can it divide the party a little bit and make some progress, or is it pretty much just going to kind of be the same Obama-Israeli policy of not really taking a strong stand for Israel, but at the same time never standing up for the Palestinians? I
think it's possible. I think by saying that we can't have a war with Iran, they're indirectly opposing Israel. I think that most of these candidates are also very strongly against Saudi Arabia at the moment. They're out of favor. I personally think they're really just have a problem with the current leadership of Saudi Arabia, not Saudi Arabia itself. But right now there's the whole Khashoggi thing that comes up, and they all seem to take a pretty strong stance on that. And since Saudi Arabia and Israel are, closely allied right now, and they're working towards some of the same objectives, that's also indirectly going against Israel. Trying to think of any other way that might happen. It's a strong lobby, and not only they provide a lot of campaign funding, pro-Israel Americans, but they're also, known to be very effective at running primary challengers against candidates or against incumbents. And also, like they may run attack ads. They may outrun attack ads against them. They fear that lobby. It's not the only lobby they fear, but it's definitely one of the ones. So no, I really wouldn't expect any significant opposition from either party, frankly.
All right, Joanne. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. And as this season unfolds and we have more debates, I'll have you back on the show to kind of continue to talk about these positions. And like I said, especially you kind of coming from that direction, I think you probably understand the party and politics a little bit more. So it's been incredibly interesting. And just tell my audience where they can find your show. That way they want to listen to you more often, which you should, because, not only do you have me on sometimes, but you also have on like real foreign policy experts like Elijah Madnier.
Yeah, probably. Pretty much everybody has smartphones now, mobile phones. There are good podcast apps on any of the mobile podcast apps you can find around the empire. You can find me at Joanne Leon on Twitter. You can find Around the Empire on Twitter at Around the Empire. And you can always go to aroundtheempire.com.
All right. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Kyle. Really appreciate it.